If we speak about intuitive tech, there's no way to deny the role of VR and AR technologies. Yet, many times, VR and AR are being seen as gimmicks, nothing more than gimmicks, something to play with. There's no real goal to use them. Yet, the following speakers will share their ideas about the use of AR and VR, and they will outline the opportunity that virtual space presents to enhancing reality. Please welcome to stage Anita Fontaine and Geoffrey Lillemon, creative directors at the Department of New Realities at Wieden+Kennedy, Amsterdam. Put your hands together, please.
Oh, we're already mic'd. Oh my God, this is is this the Project Runway talk? I think we're in the wrong venue. Gotta say, that's a rich entrance, somehow.
Strong entrance.
Yeah, it's, yeah. Well, we're very happy to be here, and we'll get cracking. This is Anita and Geoffrey, and together we're Hello. Happy to be here. And yeah, so we've been working together for a long time, and it's always been on the verge of technology and art and how we can just play with infusing a bit of soul into technology. And we worked as artists playing with how we can bring art into video games, and then we became entrepreneurs and ran a business for many years called Champagne Valentine. And now we're the creative directors at the Department of New Realities at Wieden+Kennedy here in Amsterdam. And we've been working there for 2.5 years.
But not always. I guess it's interesting to point out a little bit of where we came from a long time ago, purely because it speaks a little bit to why we're interested in VR and I guess these virtual landscapes. And where we grew up, it was kind of like a suburban place in Australia and America. There wasn't much culture going on, so I think that really fed into the idea of us creating these fantasies and almost like these escapist worlds. And ultimately, we are always thinking about how to marry art and technology in a way to manifest these fantasies. It's been an ongoing theme of our work for the last 15 years.
Yeah, and to expand more on the introduction, our first foray into this idea of technology and art was what we're calling like with the lowbrow video games, and we were using the Unreal Engine many years ago, way before it was a mainstream VR and AR production engine. This is really when it was a shoot-up game where you're shooting aliens and kind of playing into this sort of like a masculine gaming mentality, and then infusing that with a bit of a feminist perspective of just having mythological characters that are like playing with like psychedelia and playing with this sort of a human heartbeat approach into that gaming platform that was not meant for that. And also being able to work with this idea of intimate internet, and that was playing with like how we can see websites as an art medium in themselves and be able to create artwork as it was intended to be seen in a website medium as opposed to being in a gallery or a museum space. And so this was really kind of in year 2000, 2001, and kind of like playing with these sentiments of relocating traditional art experiences into escapist fantasy one-on-one spaces like you and the internet alone in your bedroom or chateau, depending on bank account.
And then we also worked a lot in kind of traditional film and music videos and content for big screens for pop music. But I guess we're always consistently trying to bring in different ideas about interface design or like future aesthetic, even to something linear like a music video or a short film. And then thinking about more speculative fiction ideas, like creating an art piece that was an installation, a looping video, but the theme was really around what about the afterlife in the digital, in regards to the digital landscape, like what happens to your data after you die, and what happens to your avatar after you die. So just thinking about these potential escapist kind of worlds that relate to kind of where we are now in our tech culture.
Yeah, and with that data, thinking about design solutions for, do we want to take care of our data after we're dead? Do we want to put it in like in spa car scenarios, do something positive with it, just try to spin it into something that is that takes care of it in a nurturing way? Or do we want to do something evil and apocalyptic with that data? So it's all things to consider, and it also starts to challenge how we start thinking about the presence that we're leaving online. And these are just like sort of intro slides of all the different capacities that we think within. And so our philosophy has always just been like, all right, how can we think about things of the future? How can we think about things of the past, and kind of like formulate it into different approaches? And also, we could sell our data now and then have it become like, say, like we generate avatars from how we behave now. They could be cyborg fashion models of the future as well. So we can exploit our future self and play with different ways of angling that data into different scenarios for good or evil.
Yeah, and I guess another big theme of what we're interested in is thinking about aesthetics and optics, and almost how we work a lot in 3D and using kind of PC software and game engine technology to think about like how can we kind of change the perspective of how we see the future, what it looks like, what it feels like in these augmented and virtual spaces.
Yeah, and a lot of times what we do is, to give the technology a soul, is play with almost an anti-design punk aesthetic. And that's just to avoid following too many constraints and rules, and trying to just make sure that it has feeling. And sometimes the longer we go on, we start infusing it with technique and certain systems that do make sense. But the intention is not being stinted by like, oh, you shouldn't do that because that's not the right design practice. So we're just trying to give that technology and design approach just an edge and play with what feels right and avoid what doesn't feel right. And a lot of times that comes across as a grittiness that we're infusing the work with.
Yeah, and I think essentially from all of this kind of background inspiration, we did start seeing many different possibilities, and some of these are very depressing and dystopian, and others are really optimistic. But ultimately, as we started the Department of New Realities, we saw just infinite possibilities. I think that we were really excited to help redefine the future's landscape and to help think of ways to enhance reality with this technology.
Yeah, and all of this is putting us in a position of helping to redefine or define the future's landscape and have a point of view on it, because there's a lot of different people and organizations working towards that goal, but we just want to make sure that we have a say in it and try to be as poetic and sensitive to what the future could be, to just try to help make the world a more interesting place. And DPTNR, the Department of New Realities, our culture reflects what's happening within current tech culture. So we're not always stuck into augmented reality or virtual reality or the newest buzzword of the kind of like the time and the trend. And we have an overall philosophy of like, all right, how can we adapt to different technologies and infuse it with this kind of idea of enhancing reality? So our whole team is compiled of 3D generalists, art directors, creative directors, producers, sound people, programmers, so everybody has a sort of multi-versatile ability to swap roles with each other. Like the 3D people also know how to do interactive programming. And so this allows us to kind of like be like, oh, what's this new kind of like holographic tech that's come out? Let's be able to rapidly prototype and make something for that and end up making experiences that people haven't seen before. and getting out of like a tech demo world and making art with new technology as a medium.
Yeah, and I think what's important to us is thinking about it from a conceptual point of view. So having a speculative future kind of vision before we start a project, or thinking about something as an experiment, really is a lot of how we work, starting with like a concept that potentially leads into a bigger, either self-initiated project, or often a client will see the speculative fiction work and want something similar, or it will inspire them to kind of think differently about what they're asking for and what their brand might need. For instance, this is a piece that we do a lot of Instagram content around this theme of speculative future. And this is thinking about a world where basically like AI might need to meditate, or maybe AI can actually be a helpful tool in terms of meditation and mindfulness in the future. And that was just kind of a piece that we explored in terms of like a pre-rendered animation. But that really led into us thinking about, well, how could we actually change consciousness with this technology, and using everything that we've been learning about haptics and technology and mindfulness, how can we kind of integrate everything together and think about an actual pod where you could sit inside and it could sense how you feel, and the temperature could change, or the sound could change, or a guided meditation happens, but basically this fully sensory experience. And that's a lot of how we work. These things kind of lead into a bigger project.
Yeah, and also another example of this sort of speculative vision approach is looking at how can we look at money in a new way. So there's the CryptoKitties currency, which is a Bitcoin currency that is interesting because it's adding identity to money. And so we were playing around with these ideas of almost like cats that you would have to clean their litter box, take care of them, do all of these kind of like absurd things, but it's a digital pet that has monetary value. So it's like thinking about money itself as something that can be nurtured and taken care of, or neglected, and how that affects economical practices. And so starting like to kind of like play into that idea of how we can have an emotional bond with a monetary facility around us.
Yeah, and so we see a lot of the time that these kind of base ideas that we have on a conceptual level can be converted into something that the client desires, essentially. A lot of the time they don't really know what they want or they're looking for, and that's kind of where we can slot in perfectly to kind of create a possibility or a new landscape for their brand, or an environment, or like a system that they can kind of step inside of and get a new kind of interaction. So this is a more tangible example of that. We created an installation. It was a VR game called Bitmap Banshees, and ultimately, in a kind of way, the client did see this installation, which was like a self-initiated artwork that we had on display, and they wanted something in the same vein. It wasn't exactly the same, but essentially the game itself is set in Amsterdam, kind of a post-apocalyptic Amsterdam, and you have to kind of ride through the streets and collect these carrots, and it's a little bit like Frogger, but in 3D. But I think what we did is really whet their appetite for being able to see this technology in a physical, tangible way, which maybe was new to them, and that really led to a super interesting brief.
Yeah, and part of what was sort of interesting from the client's eyes was the fact that we were dealing with tangibility, and the fact that you could physically feel the bike. There was haptics on it, so it was vibrating when you were bumping into things. You were pedaling to have to motivate yourself through the environment. And there was a risk to it. Like you could slip off the pedal, shatter your leg, bleed. All of these things were simulations of the world around us that we can touch and feel and enjoy or be harmed by. And it was amplified, and there was something that was like appealing to them with that, about like, okay, we like what you're doing there. We see what you're doing, how you're using fans to create the feeling of wind. You're creating heat. You're creating the haptic scenario. You're creating the physical build. And so we put the client, in it themselves, and so they're able to like ride and move and be freaking out and everything. And
there was just like a strong sense of voyeurism, I think, which is really important. And for a client to really see like a physical installation in that way that incorporates technology, I think it was pretty exciting. And so they briefed us in a way that they wanted the installation to touch all the senses.
Yeah, and so they also they said that as well. They're like, we want something that touches all the senses, but can you take out all the freaks? So it was an example of our art direction and aesthetic not being appropriate for, in this case, Corona. But
it was appropriate for us personally.
Yeah, we loved the idea. Like we felt connected to it, but we could still have commercial viability without necessarily having to be unnatural or untrue to our own agenda and our own, motivation for making these experiences. Like, we're not huge fans of going and hanging out on the beach all the time and being underneath the sunset. We're children of the moon, so it's like it's important to like establish that kind of communication with these clients, and then we can get away with making art and being absurd and playing with this new technology, and then still having a job that it makes sense, so that we can kind of sell this stuff through and be, fulfilling marketing agendas that and business problems that they have to solve. And so we're helping each other in that capacity.
Yeah, so essentially they were like, can we not have the goth zombie version, but can we have like the beach paradise version of that, which is super interesting to us, because how can you replicate nature, first of all, in a way that feels ethically sound? But in a way we were solving a real issue, because the whole project was set in Mexico City, and there is a dilemma there where people are a bit disconnected to nature. It's such a massive city with very little access to nature. And so what does lack of nature do to the brain? That's like a huge problem, I think, in general in society. So we felt like pretty psyched for that brief even.
Yeah, and it's and so the whole kind of intention was that people would come into like a Berlin club kind of atmosphere, and then they would be escorted by some nature fairies into a giant Corona cooler or vending machine, and then they would walk around a paradise that they can feel and touch, and then come out and be transported to a paradise environment where, so they can see the stark contrast between one world being, this sort of city urban vibe, and then the contrast of hard editing to paradise.
A bit of Freddy Krueger.
Yeah, and a Freddy Krueger soundtrack, just for,
Just for
since
fun.
we're the ones on stage talking about it.
Yeah, so, we're not doctors and we're not scientists, but we're really fascinated by the use of VR to affect the brain and to kind of trick the brain into thinking that it's actually in nature in this case. So it was it felt like quite a powerful project to be involved in, and immersing people in that space was super beneficial.
Yeah, and it was also, it got us really thinking about, this sort of like, what is the effect that VR has? And it has a stronger effect on the brains of these children, our children, everyone's children, than it does adults. And so children's intuition with these things have a much stronger perspective, and so we have to listen to them. And so we did a project where we asked children to come in and help us direct a VR gaming experience called the Senseless Fairy Tale the Senseless Fairy Tale. And the whole intention was like, okay, let's try to make like a children's game that has traditional gameplay mechanics of having a world and an environment, a challenge that you have to overcome, and then you get rewarded for defeating or accomplishing that challenge, like the kind of basic mechanics of classic gameplay. And the kids, after trying out the prototypes, were much more interested in environments of expression where they're able to almost draw, play music, just express their own individual perspective on things and affect the world that is directly impacted by them, as opposed to play in the framework of a reality defined by us as adults. And so we ended up making this project where instead of it being a game, it was just like a nonsense playground where the kids could draw and then they could make music, and they were really happy, and it was also very successful for adults to be in that. So it's kind of like, all right, so the kids are like the mega brains of the future, so like they should just direct.
There's something about like the power of VR, being able to step inside someone else's shoes.
The senseless
Gives a sense of empathy.
Yeah, exactly.
This is where we want to be. Buzz the Beast.
And this is just proof that technology wants and needs our soul to be interesting, and it's not trying to like leave humanity and not include us in the process. And it's very important that that we're married with technology and that we collaborate together, and that it's not two distinct kinds of things. And this next example is where we made a puppet that uses the HTC Vive VR controllers, and you can swing them around, and we can control a puppet live on a stage being projected on a transparent screen. And we made the system, we made the tool, but we weren't able to get any good animation or feeling out of it until we gave it to a musician and a dancer that was able to, like, off of like 1 or 2 tries, bring a beautiful sense of life into the movement of this puppet. And this is somebody who has no training in using this kind of interface that we made, and there was an inherent understanding of the naturalness of the interface that allowed for a moment of expression, a moment of dance, almost like being a real performer with a body enhanced extension. But we have to think about also the audience, and so this performer is grabbing the soul and infusing it into technology. But then what we also learned from this project is that the audience is sitting there and they're watching this moment of technology dancing with the human heartbeat and the human soul. And there's something very relaxing about that. Like, we're playing with technology, but it's not bothering us all the time, that it's paced and it has a sense of grace that allows for it to be accessible and be integrated into our environment in a really nice way.
Yeah, and I think essentially we're trying to create technology-led experiences that are less demanding mentally. I think there's so much competing for our attention that it can feel quite overwhelming. So in a way, some of our projects, we're trying to take a step back and think about it in a passive way, almost like, how can we do the opposite to your attention span? How can we make you feel relaxed? How can we chill you out? How can we not make you anxious, not make you feel some of the things that these technologies have the reputation of doing? So with this project, we took inspiration from 1970s culture, like shag carpets, basically the kind of music that was flowing at that time, record sleeves, and just the culture of sitting around and watching a lava lamp and while you listen to a record, like that kind of culture from the 70s. And we created a project called Lava, which is essentially fusing record players and augmented reality for a musician called Necessary Explosion. So we visualized his whole album release, and essentially the augmented reality plays on top of a record. While you're in the room, you can like kind of passively experience the work, and you can kind of continue to hang out in the living room and do your thing. And then when you look over, you can still continue to see these psychedelic sculptures that change depending on the music track that plays.
Yeah, like really playing on the ritual of the album sleeve, a concept of diving into fantasy and then going back to your business as usual, of just enjoying the evening and not necessarily having to give your attention to the device the entire night. But here's an example of how we're using audio fingerprinting to understand what song is playing, almost like Shazam, and then relaying that to specific augmented reality content.
'Cause I know what you don't know, that there is so much to talk about. It seems I am ruled by sorry.
And we learned something about, well, of course, the value of 70s freedom with technology. And it was just, there was something about that ritual that was like, okay, so we can play with these technologies in a way that doesn't demand all of your attention, but we can also do the complete opposite. And there can be cases where we do want to spend 100% of our time with the device. And in the case of having an augmented reality assistant or like a workout instructor, these kind of things can be kind of a motivating factor. So we need to address that from time to time as well.
And that was a really good instance where we kind of used absurdity and humor with technology in a way that got attention from a new business perspective. We got a call from Montclair, and they were like, can you put clothes on those things? Essentially, can you create an augmented reality lookbook for this printed page version of the lookbook coming out, which is super interesting to us because we're, when it comes to new technology meets old technology, this is really perfect for us to try and, in a way, like reinvent what the printed page might be. So the collection had 9 different designers, and so for each designer in the book, we came up with an augmented reality experience, essentially with sound and immersive, that you can kind of get to know the collection and the designer in a different kind of perspective.
Yeah, and every single one, in some ways it was about representing the clothing, and other times it was more environment effects, like starting the world around you in fire, and other times being more literal of showing what the actual garments look like. And I think as a wrap-up, we're using speculative vision, we're using beauty, we're using absurdity, all of these different things to help define what the future can be and give the technology a soul and a feeling. And for example, this is having our friend use his facial expressions and then infusing that into the personality of this sort of super graphics card of the future. And so we're always playing with kind of how we can use all of these different criterias just to make sure that the environments in the digital world that we're working with just feels relatable, and use this to enhance reality. And that's sort of our philosophical ambition from the department and how we can define tomorrow's landscape.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anita and Geoffrey. Thank you very much for giving insight into the playground that you created for yourself and you're making a living with, so compliments for that.
Very welcome.
You want to stay seated?
Sure.
Yeah, sure. I'll
Finish the wine.
Yeah, okay. Well, I can't join you for the wine, unfortunately, but I am willing to join you over there at the bar with all these people in a couple of minutes.
Sure.
One thing sprung to mind. You speak about the necessity of people to be close to nature. And then you created this bewildering jungle to be experienced with VR for a beer brand for 6 days and nights. Which seemed quite, with all respect, unsustainable thing to do. We've been talking about sustainability all afternoon, so that's a theme that's still lingering in our mind. Would you see any potential in the learnings of that project for, let's say, people living in dense city environments to use that kind of technology and experience to improve their lives, instead of just having fun on the...
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and something we always try and push for sustainability as much as possible. Obviously, there was a lot of computer power and a lot of electricity going into that project. I think outside that, what we were really, and we were also ethically confused ourselves, like, how can we use technology to actually reconnect people to nature? But we started reading about the power of VR to kind of transform people's minds, and this can be used on an intimate level. You know, someone in their bedroom can have a feeling of being inside a forest, and it can do wonderful things to their mind and their imagination. And I think that was really what we kind of felt inspired to kind of pursue and to kind of try and, I guess, we really wanted people to see nature that couldn't potentially. Like, we were coming at it from a pure place. It might not have been the most perfectly sustainable thing, but essentially the power of this technology to place people inside an environment that they couldn't normally be in was enough for us to keep pushing. And I think continues to be something that we're really interested in as like a very powerful medium for people that might have an illness or might not be able to move, might be handicapped, to be able to have these experiences in environments that they couldn't move to is just incredible to us, and I think that's enough to keep us going along this path.
Yeah, it would be interesting if you would be able somehow, or if some other institutions would be able to find you in order to exactly make this possible in elderly homes, for instance, in hospitals, in schools. Well, you can think of a lot of applications.
Yeah.
And I think you found a very powerful tool to actually improve the lives of people. And it would be great if that tool would be out there for a bigger group of people.
Yeah, we agree. Hopefully get to evolve it more. Yeah.
So if you don't mind, I would like to take this as the closing comment for today.